Remaking Middle School is launching a middle school listening tour. We want to know what comes to mind when you hear middle school. What do you think is and isn't working for middle school students today? What is the future of middle-level education? If you are any of the following, a parent, a teacher, administrator, youth development professional, policymaker, or youth advocate of middle grade students, we would love to hear from you. There are two ways in which you can lend your voice to this project. You can complete an online survey. The survey will take about 10 minutes to complete. Or you can chat with a member of the Remaking Middle School team. Interviews take about 30 to 45 minutes of your time and can be done by phone or Zoom. If you're interested in sharing your perspective on middle school education, please visit remakingmiddleschool.org and click Sign Up for the listening tour. Hi, this is Jason Cascarino. Thanks for listening to the Lessons in Adolescence podcast, a production of the Remaking Middle School Initiative, whose founding partners include Youth-Nex, the University of Virginia's Center to Promote Effective Youth Development, and the Association for Middle-Level Education, or AMLE. You can learn about Remaking Middle School on the web at remakingmiddleschool.org. Now, here's this episode. Hello and welcome to the Lessons in Adolescence podcast, where we explore the many facets that impact young adolescents in the middle school years. From the adverse to the awkward to the awesome, I'm your host, Jason Cascarino. Today, I talk with Nat Kendall-Taylor, CEO of Frameworks Institute. Frameworks plays a unique role in the social sector. It uses the science behind how human beings learn about and understand the world around them in order to position or frame social causes in ways that compel people to take positive action or change. For a number of years, Frameworks has been developing strategies and resources to help educators and advocates reframe adolescence in ways that better call out aspects of exploration, discovery, and openness, which balance out traditional messages of angst and risky behaviors.
So you want your messages to convey that kind of openness. And openness is a neutral concept, right? Openness isn't positive or negative. But what we have to realize is that our discourse about young people is overwhelmingly negative. Our narratives are overwhelmingly kind of danger, aligned. And what we need to do is not get woo-woo and hopey-changey and unrealistic about how adolescence is this wonderful, rosy, good all the time kind of time of life. But we do need to communicate in ways that balance the kind of risk, which is real, with the opportunity, which is equally real. And so what I would love to see is people who are communicating about these issues, almost more than anything else, is to really think about that idea of balance. How do I counteract an overwhelmingly negative discourse by introducing the idea of opportunity, of learning, of the potential of this period of time?
In part one of our conversation, Nat and I talk about how Frameworks got its start and the role it plays in the social sector, the research-based process it uses to develop compelling narratives for important issues and topics, and how Frameworks has used that process to reframe adolescence. In part two, we talk about some of the ways Frameworks supports organizations and the broader field to use the most effective language and channels of communication to showcase the opportunity of adolescence, how to help parents and families balance their understanding and impressions of their own adolescent children, the power of positive examples and story of adolescence, the role of framing in bridging polarization and the cultural and political divides in education, as well as other domains, and some of the new areas Frameworks is looking to expand into or go deeper in. That's in just a little bit. Now, here's part one of my interview with Nat Kendall-Taylor. Nat, it is a delight to have you here. Thanks so much for joining me.
Great to be here. Nice to see you. Nice to hear you.
Well, as you and our listeners know, this is a podcast where we think and talk about the early adolescent time period, and we think and talk about as many aspects of that phase of human development as we can. But what we haven't yet thought and talked about is, ironically, thinking and talking about it. That is to say, how we as researchers and educators and advocates, parents, everyday adults, even young people themselves, think and talk about young adolescents, and importantly, how we should think and talk about this consequential time of life. So that's a lot of what we're going to do in this conversation. But before we get into all of that, let's talk a little bit about you. You've been the CEO of Frameworks Institute for more than 13 years. years. You are an anthropologist by trade. Tell us what drew you to anthropology and how your work in that field set you up to lead Frameworks Institute.
Sure. So I've been at the organization for more than 13 years, almost 14 years. I came on as a researcher and I've been CEO for probably since 2015, so the last 7 years. This is the only real job I've ever had. I did my graduate studies at UCLA and then did some applied anthropology primarily in East Africa and Kenya, studying how families with children with chronic seizure disorders make treatment decisions, kind of the way that culture influences how people think about health and illness and well-being, and how that influences the choices that they make, which I realize sounds like a million miles away from what I do now in studying how Americans primarily think about social issues and how the choices that we make and how we communicate affect that thinking. But it's actually not. A lot of the same theory and methods that I used as a psychological anthropologist on the Swahili coast of Kenya are exactly the same as what I use now, which is at its core, this idea that culture influences how we think, that those families that I was working with in Kenya were using culture to make treatment decisions. It wasn't just a product of how far a clinic was away from their house or how expensive a given treatment was. It was really what they saw as the cause of epilepsy, what was at the root of seizures, and what they believed to be causing that condition shaped the solutions and the treatments that they sought and kind of how they understood and made sense of this complex medical issue. In the same way that the decisions that we make as Americans when it comes to social issues, do we support pretrial justice reform? How do we think about young people? How do we think about aging and ageism? All of that thinking, all of those decisions that we make are influenced by culture. They are influenced by the mindsets that we have and share, and how those mindsets kind of shape the way that we understand ourselves, we understand our country, we understand our communities, and how we make choices based on those mindsets. So it sounds a million miles away, kind of where I've come from and what I do now, but it is surprisingly close and related.
Well, let's go one notch deeper on that. Frameworks Institute plays an interesting and probably unique role. You'll correct me. When we think about how we communicate things or how we message ideas, we maybe think about marketing or public relations. That's not what Frameworks is about. Tell us how Frameworks got its start and the role that it plays in the social sector.
Yeah, so I'm going to channel my former colleague and boss, Susan Bales, who founded Frameworks in 1999, so a number of years ago. And Susan worked for a very long time as a communications professional on social issues. So kind of how do we get people to be more considerate of progressive social issues and to support policy change and solutions. And again, she was struck by the fact that there is precious little research that enters into that conversation, that those decisions, how do we talk about reproductive rights, how do we talk about early childhood, how do we talk about poverty, are made by really smart people who know about communications and those issues, who kind of go with their gut in terms of what they think is going to work. And as an inquisitive, critical intellectual, Susan was dubious about that as a practice and saw these questions of what is the best way to communicate about poverty that pulls people into the issue, that builds this sense of collective responsibility, as empirical questions, meaning these are questions that we can design research to answer. And she kind of went on a quest to learn about all the different academic disciplines who have something to say about that question. And she talked with political scientists and anthropologists and sociologists and linguists, and kind of slowly put together a group of people who could do this kind of research, who could ask and answer those kinds of questions. And that became the foundation of what Frameworks was and remains today. It's been a lot of changes. Initially, that work was done with academics at various institutions. And then when I came on in 2008, kind of started to bring that research expertise in-house, and have since 2008 really built out a theory of practice, a way of doing that research that kind of consistently and predictably generates answers to those kinds of questions. How do people think about these complex issues that we talk about all the time? And then how can we position them? How can we make decisions about how we communicate about those issues that begin to shift that thinking and open up new space to think about those issues, and importantly, to have conversations and think about what's required to address or solve them?
Yeah, I want to get into some of that because I'm personally just fascinated by just the mechanics around how that is determined and how those developed, the way people think, and how you can shape that and frame that, which is obviously in the name. Frameworks covers a lot of issues. How did adolescence become one of the issues that you took on?
Yeah, that is a great question. I think on my second day of working at Frameworks, I walked into a meeting of the National Scientific Council on the Developing Child. So this is a group of, at that time, North American scientists who work on early childhood issues. Frameworks had been working with this group since their founding, before their founding, and our role with that partner is to figure out how to take this really complicated but incredibly important science and bring it out of the academy, bring it out of the research world into policy and practice decision-making context, and importantly, to kind of bring it into the public conversation. And so Framework stood kind of between science and practice and policy on issues of early childhood, and have been working at that kind of nexus, at that critical point for a number of years. And, it doesn't take that much work or thinking about early childhood to realize very quickly that it doesn't end at 5 years old, that development remains this kind of open and sensitive window through which experiences influence biology and outcomes well on into our lives, and that this science not only points at a critical or a sensitive period between the beginning of life to 3 or 5, but that there is this second critical window, this second sensitive period in which people are incredibly open to the influence of experiences, and the relationships and experiences that people have during adolescence shape development in truly profound ways. And so I have been interested in adolescent development since I started working on early childhood development. And I think it took a little while for us to find the right partners. It took a little while for the field more generally to realize that it wasn't just about early childhood, that young kids weren't all that matters, that it wasn't just early matters and then done, but that early matters and so does later, was kind of a thing that I took, obviously not you, Jason, but it took kind of the wider field that's interested in human development a little while to come to this period of life as a critical one to do that science translation, that movement from research to practice.
Yeah, I still feel like we're kind of on the leading edge of adolescence kind of coming more to the forefront. And what's interesting, talking about early childhood, is that so much of that research, Jim Heckman, for example, who's one of the premier researchers in that field, I think a lot of his research did point to exactly what you're talking about. You can't just do early childhood and stop there, that you have to have these very sustained supports, and particularly in through adolescence and even beyond. You and I, Nat, got first connected a few years back. I was working with the University of Virginia's Youth-Nex Center and the Association for Middle Level Education. We were putting on a convening in Washington on middle school, of which you generously participated in. It was our attempt to bring people across many silos together on this topic. But near the top of the convening, we did this exercise. It was a room about 125 people. These were researchers, educators, advocacy folks, in-school folks, out-of-school folks. And we asked people to think of one word that they would associate with the middle school years. It could be it could be their experience or their child's or a niece or nephew's or just their general impression. We gave them a moment to do that. And then we said, okay, if your word has a positive connotation, move to this side of the room. If your word has a negative connotation, move to that side of the room. And if your word is neutral, stay somewhere in the middle of the room. And in this very scientific, dare I say, frameworks-worthy study, the result was about 2/3 gravitated to the negative side of the room. And the remaining 1/3 were split between positive and neutral. Tell me if you're surprised at all about that result, and then tell me, from Framework's equally scientific study of adolescence, why people might split up into that ratio.
Yeah, I actually think that is a fantastic kind of thought experiment. It's actually a really great test of mindsets, as an indicator of the weight and the size of mindsets that lie below the very tip of the iceberg, right? Which is what you're getting with the kind of word cue. Also keep in mind that those are researchers who study adolescents and work with young people. And if you did that with a population of RPs, as we call them, real people, I bet that room would look really different. I bet 90% of those people, 95% of those people would have been on the negative side of the room.
And you've done some of that, right? Because you've gone out, I've seen these where you've gone out and interviewed people on the street, as it were, right? And asked them what they think about some of these issues.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think again, this is indicative of what a cultural mindset is and how it works. We have a mindset of young people, of adolescents, of adolescent development, in which we see it as a dangerous time, that there are overwhelmingly negative ways of thinking about this period of life as people's models of the risk that's inherent in the environments of young people, coupled with what people see as the openness of this period of life. And the trifecta is the assumption that young people are very poor decision makers and kind of don't do the right things, even to look out after their own well-being, let alone that of their peers or community. If environments during adolescence are overwhelmingly negative, plus they're easily influenced and they can't make decisions, then, is it surprising that we generate words like, ugh, that's not a word, but a sound, or you just got to make it through, or, oh my goodness, I remember how awkward that was, or all of these kind of negative and unfortunate things. I, in that room, Jason, probably would have been in the middle, and my word would have been open. So the science, and you know this better than I do, the science of adolescent development really points to the openness of this time of life, the sensitivity to experiences, to relationships, to resources and context and all of these things. And the both beautiful thing and slightly thing with a bit more gravity is that makes experiences incredibly important, right? That makes the ways that we support young people and give them opportunities to experience risk and have meaningful experiences all the more important, that openness. I think what you've done there is an experiment in mindsets, and you've found that people have ways of thinking about young people that lead them to endorse these negative words associated with the time. And I'm really interested. So if I did that experiment, I would want to talk to all those people and kind of get under the surface of their word. Why is it that you said ugh? Why is it that you have such negative ideas of this period of life?
Yeah, and my speculation as to why our field of education and youth hasn't paid, in my view, adequate attention or made adequate investments in this early adolescent period is probably because of mindsets. There's, as you know, a lot of the attention investment tends to skew towards early childhood, but then it sort of skips over to college and career and workforce. I want to get more into the mechanics here. As I mentioned, you at Frameworks have worked to articulate in compelling ways, and you were just doing that, the opportunity that is the early adolescent period. And when I read what you've put together, it seems to me, you use the word open. I picked up on the words exploration and discovery. In this space, we often gravitate to wonky words like and edu-speak, right? So like we say things like identity formation and agency and self-efficacy. And all of that is true, but it seems like you try and find some anchor words or concepts that are not only true, but they better and more broadly resonate. Tell us just a little bit about that process that Frameworks uses to do that, and by way of example, how you went about determining the right framing for adolescents.
I think a lot of what guides our perspective, our approach to this is this kind of underlying truism that when I say it, you're going to nod your head, but that when it comes to communicating frequently is the first thing to leave our minds, which is you are not your audience, right? You and the people you work with on adolescent development are not representative of the people you are trying to communicate with, are not representative of the kind of people you are trying to kind of move and persuade with your communications. And so that, in essence, is the core of what we do. So we are really committed to understanding what a field of practice wants to be able to communicate. If you could have people understand three things, Jason, about adolescence, about adolescent development, about young people and supporting young people, what would they be? So that's kind of our first question on all of our project is what needs to be said? What ideas do we need to get in more robust and accessible ways out into the public discourse? And then we take a step back and we figure out, how do normal people, no offense, people who don't live and eat and sleep and breathe adolescent development like you and your colleagues do every day, think about these concepts? What are those mindsets that lead to those predictable answers? And we have a number of ways that we do that, both through qualitative research that really comes from my discipline of anthropology and cognitive linguistics, but also quantitative research where we're trying to determine the relative strength of different mindsets across groups of people. Most important question becomes, how do I get my ideas through? What is the story we should be telling? And that's where we're really interested in kind of some of the concepts that you just talked about, metaphor. How can creating metaphors that compare one thing that people are really familiar with to something that they're less familiar with help unlock thinking? Values. How do we appeal to common values in a way that explains, that resonates with people and gives them an answer to the question of, why does this issue matter for me? So we develop all kinds of different framing elements like those, and we test them. We take them out into the field and we see what happens. What happens if you talk about adolescent development as a process of discovery and exploration? Do people get to where you want them to be? Do you create space for people to engage with the kind of concepts that you're trying to get through? Or, do you close them off? Do people go in some wild and unpredicted directions, which happens to probably about 80 to 90% of the ideas that we have? And then the last stop in the process, which is the most important stop in the process, but frustratingly, the part that we have the least expertise in and control over, is once you have frames, once you have ideas that open that space and move people into it, how do you get them out into the world? How do you mobilize new ideas at scope and scale that can kind of create shifts in thinking and change our public discussion? That, to me, is the part of this thing I am most interested in these days.
That was part one of my interview with Nat Kendall-Taylor, CEO of Frameworks Institute. In part two, we will talk about specific language and channels of communication that can be particularly effective in framing adolescence, the role of framing in the current so-called culture wars in education, and some of the future work of frameworks to equip the field with the tools for framing adolescence. That's in just a moment on the Lessons in Adolescence podcast, where we feature conversations with researchers, practitioners, program developers, and advocates for young adolescents in the middle school years. Recently, I spoke with 3 authors of Career Exploration in the Middle Grades, a playbook for educators, which was developed in partnership between the Association for Middle Level Education, or AMLE, and American Student Assistance, or ASA. Stephanie Simpson is CEO of Columbus, Ohio-based AMLE, which represents tens of thousands of middle-level educators across the country and offers a variety of resources, training, and convenings for the field. Ashley Hemme is Manager of Program Engagement at Boston-based ASA, a 60-year-old national nonprofit and student loan guarantor organization, which has expanded its mission to develop and invest in resources and tools to help students as early as middle school to explore their long-term career and educational goals. And Julie DiPilato is a 7th grade science teacher in Barnstable, Massachusetts, where she developed an array of career exploration programming in her school. As organizational, program, and teacher leaders, these 3 women showcase how well career exploration fits the developmental needs of young adolescents, which, as Ashley explains, has benefits for youth beyond learning about options for their futures.
Middle grades is kind of a weird time for kids. They're really kind of learning about their own identities. Everybody remembers themselves in middle school, and it was an awkward time, right? So for middle schoolers, that confidence, level of confidence, can tend to drop, and some of their decision-making or ideas about whether they're great at specific subjects kind of really imprints in their brains at that time. And so career exploration really allows to give kind of real-world connections to that age-old question of why am I learning about this? And not only that, has been shown to improve student confidence, improve academic success, and also support those decision-making skills.
You can catch all of my conversation with Stephanie, Ashley, and Julie in a previous episode. And now, returning for part 2 of my conversation with Nat Kendall-Taylor. In this frame is, it's one thing to understand how issues are currently framed on the one hand and how they, in the ideal, ought to be framed on the other hand. But I suspect the big challenge with what you're trying to get at here was how do you get from the former to the latter? Let's talk about this and maybe either thought experiment or give examples. If I'm a leader of, say, a summer learning program that works with young adolescents, or if I'm the leader of a nationwide advocacy organization for promoting the positive learning and development experiences for young adolescents, or if I'm a principal or a superintendent, what are the things that I can do to reframe adolescence in the minds of everyone, including, as I mentioned before, young people themselves, right, who may be listening, who are listening to the frames that we adults put on them and how that might affect their self-concept and their behavior.
Yeah, so there's both like the things that you would say differently, but then there's also the channels or the ways that you deliver those things. And I guess what I was trying to say in my last answer is I'm equally interested in both of those things. I'm interested in what you say, kind of changing from messages that inadvertently reinforce this kind of dangerous time, risky period of life, to presenting issues in more balanced ways. But I'm also interested in how, if you're a superintendent or a principal or someone working at a summer learning program, kind of how can you start to talk to new people? How can you use different tools, whether that's social media, whether that's connecting to a collaborative campaign? Like, how do you get these messages out into the world in different ways? But I'll start with the first. So the first and most important thing that people in this field or in these fields can do is really think about that concept of balance. So you want your messages to convey that kind of openness. And openness is a neutral concept, right? Openness isn't positive or negative. But what we have to realize is that our discourse about young people is overwhelmingly negative. Our narratives are overwhelmingly kind of danger, aligned. And what we need to do is not get woo-woo and hopey-changey and unrealistic about how adolescence is this wonderful, rosy, good all the time kind of time of life. But we do need to communicate in ways that balance the kind of risk, which is real, with the opportunity, which is equally real. And so what I would love to see is people who are communicating about these issues, almost more than anything else, is to really think about that idea of balance. How do I counteract an overwhelmingly negative discourse by introducing the idea of opportunity, of learning, of the potential of this period of time? It is the thing that if everybody could do it over the next 10 years, I'm highly confident it would change culture. It would begin to shift the mindsets that we have and hold and apply to think about young people.
I wonder where parents sort of fit into this mix as we work in the world of educators and researchers, et cetera. But when you think about channels, that's one of the primary channels, right, of where kids get information, their impressions of themselves and how people generally, the normal people, the NPs, think about these issues. How do you think about that sort of angle, the parent and family angle?
One of the really interesting things about your question is this way of thinking about, if you think that these are dangerous times as a parent and the environments are overwhelmingly negative, it starts to make sense as to how much emphasis we put on protection, on kind of walling kids off and keeping them, ironically, from the experiences that the science shows they need to have in order to develop in positive and healthy ways. And so I think that in some way, understanding mindsets can help us understand our own kind of reactions and proclivities when it comes to this period of life. But the hope is that this work can help everyone, parents included. And it has really helped me as a parent think about this time of life in that kind of more neutral and open way, and better understand the need for risk, understand the need for meaningful social experiences, and that my job as a parent is provide those opportunities in safe contexts rather than to put up those walls and keep those things from happening. So I do think, obviously, this work is not, like, parents is probably not the primary audience for this work. I think it's really designed for, Jason, probably people like yourselves, people who are researchers or advocates. But I think there is a tremendous amount that parents can learn about their own thinking as members of our culture, and probably, some ways that they can talk to both young people and other parents in different ways that start to unlock new ways of thinking about these issues.
Yeah, I just think I'm not the first to observe this. There's just a big gap in knowledge. For me, my personal experience is that just understanding these issues, it's like a personal check. Like I know I have a default of protection, but I can at least pause for a moment and say, okay, is this really threatening? Or is this his interest in pushing the boundaries and exploring who he is and what his place is in the world and all of that? So I think minimally, just that understanding probably is maybe for a lot of people good enough so that they can just at least pause and make sure that they're doing things that are developmentally appropriate in their interaction with their child.
I mean, a lot of framing, Jason, is about hitting that pause button. So, frames, some of the best frames are just interrupters. They kind of suspend our default thinking and allow us to engage in kind of more effortful, deeper consideration of something. There's Daniel Kahneman is probably the most famous behavioral scientist, behavioral economist, and he talks about kind of system one thinking and system two thinking. And system one thinking is protection, Jason. System one thinking is the thing that leads you and I both to say, whoa, that's not happening. And system two thinking might be, slower. Kahneman talks about it being slow thinking. So kind of the more effortful thinking that might allow us to really consider whether an experience is truly dangerous or whether it's just something that makes us mildly uncomfortable as a parent. And I think frames are centrally about suspending system one and activating system two. I mean, metaphors are really great at that, kind of giving us an alternative view and a perspective and hitting pause. Stories and examples of young people doing things that do not comport with our mindsets is another great one. So another really interesting finding from this work is the power of positive examples and stories of young people doing pro-social things that have benefits that accrue to not just to themselves, but to communities. And so I think it's interesting to think about how infrequently and how light our diet is in terms of stories like that, and how those stories can really, as you're saying, kind of interrupt and provide people with the opportunity to think in different and deeper ways about adolescence. I mean, there's great experimental work in our research that shows these, huge bumps in people's support for policies that support young people following the introduction of a story about a young person doing something that benefits a community. A lot of these recommendations are not rocket science. They're things that we just don't have enough practice in thinking and can contribute to shifting the discussion in some pretty immediate and kind of light lift kind of ways.
So let's shift gears just slightly here, maybe a little bit of a detour, but I wonder what you think the role for framing is in some of what are often referred to as culture wars that are happening in the education space particularly, but in other domains as well. Most of our listeners are educators or researchers or youth advocates, and there is just a genuine anxiety about contested narratives that cut across issues of race and class and identity, values, history. It's most pronounced right now with critical race theory, but there are talks of banning books more broadly. Social emotional learning now appears to be in the crosshairs in some places, and other topics are getting caught up in it as well. I'd be curious about your views on what the role framing can and should play in all of that. Maybe not just as a means to best position one side vis-a-vis another, but also, potentially bridge common ground to the extent that that's possible.
I mean, I do think that, so much of our thinking about communications is built from this premise of segmentation, that we need to find kind of different ways of talking to these people and different ways of talking to those people. And I think that leads us to the mindset, to the assumption, to the understanding that people think in totally different, diametrically opposed ways. In part, that's true. Like, people do have different ways of thinking between political parties, between different places in the country where people live. I mean, Jason, you and I have different ways of thinking. But that doesn't mean that there aren't shared ways of thinking about issues, that there aren't common values, that there aren't common goals, that there aren't, aspirations that we hold in common. And I think, again, this sounds kind of hokey, but if we start to think about communications and framing, not just in terms of what is different, but in terms of what is common, you start to kind of have a whole new set of directions that open up. A lot of the work that we and others do around kind of values-based messaging is built from this premise that there are these highly shared values across our political polarization and divides, whether that's fairness and justice or, dignity and problem solving. I mean, there are a set of ideas and values that do resonate across these divides. And so part of dealing with polarization is to really look hard and find those things that resonate across difference and hew towards those ideas in our communications. There's this really interesting phenomenon called false polarization, where people perceive there to be more difference in terms of how they think compared with the other side, whatever that is, than there actually is. So the perception of polarization is greater than the actual differences in people's perspectives and opinions on issues. So it's fascinating. And there's a way in which when you keep that finding in mind, and you're a person in this country, in this world, who is subjected constantly to the idea of how polarized we are, that only increases our perception of how polarized we are. So part of the answer to polarization, I think, is that we balance our discourse such that it's not all about polarization, that there's a lot more stories, there's a lot more content, there's a lot more ideas about things that we have in common. And so I think the framing, kind of the way that we present information about issues, has a role to play because of its power in shaping, what people think, how they feel, and what they do.
So Nat, what is next for Frameworks? What are some of the topic areas in the education and youth space that you're beginning to tackle now or looking to tackle?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot. There's so many things in that space that I'm interested in. I guess I'll just go back and say, like, some of the most important things we're working on aren't new things. That work doesn't stop when we're done with our research. So a next step on that work is thinking about how you get those frames into the hands of people who are communicating about adolescence and adolescent development. How do you use frames to change our conversation? So that, to me, that's a big next step on the work that we're doing. While there is a need for kind of ongoing iterative research, the majority of the research is done, at least for a little while. And now we need to think about how we most effectively get that out. We're doing work with a lot of different organizations to think about that, but it is a big learning area for Frameworks, kind of that mobilization of ideas part of the work.
Finally, Nat, if there was one bit of advice based on your experience in human thinking, human behavior, on framing social causes that you would offer to educators, both in school and in after school and in summer programs, of things they either ought to know or ought to be doing, what would it be?
So this is one of these things that I'm going to say, and it will be total common sense to all those people that you just said, but I'm still going to say it because I think it's the most important thing. And it's the idea that what we know and what we have to say matters a great deal, right? The things that you know, Jason, about adolescent development, about middle school, about all of the things that you're an expert on are of consequence, but they're not all that matters, right? How you say what you have to say, the decisions that you make and how you present that information, how you engage people with it are incredibly important and can be the difference between whether your ideas get through, land, stick, and have an impact, or whether they get swallowed up or outright rejected. And so that's a long-winded way of saying my one thing that I would want to leave people with is this idea that framing matters, that the choices that we make and how we say what we have to say are of central importance to our ability to have an impact.
Nat, this has just been such a pleasure. I'm a big fan of your work, and I'm just so glad that we have you to help us think and talk about the promise of an opportunity of adolescence. So just thanks for all your contributions to this space and for this conversation.
Oh, I really appreciate it. It's been great talking with you, and we gotta catch up again soon.
That was Nat Kendall-Taylor, CEO of Frameworks Institute. You can follow Frameworks online at frameworksinstitute.org or on Twitter at frameworksinst. Thanks for joining the Lessons in Adolescence podcast, a production of Remaking Middle School, an initiative that seeks to transform the learning and development experience for young adolescents in the middle school years. Remaking Middle School brings together good educational practice in school and out of school with the latest developmental science. You can learn about Remaking Middle School or find more resources about the topics of this podcast on the web at remakingmiddleschool.org, or learn more about the founding partner organizations, the University of Virginia's Youth-Nex Center, on the web at education.virginia.edu/youth-nex, or on Twitter at youth_nex, and the Association for Middle Level Education, on the web at amle.org or on Twitter at AMLE. The Lessons in Adolescence podcast is produced by Abby Gillespie and me, Jason Cascarino. Editing by Kim Slack. You can listen to or download each episode at the Remaking Middle School website, on Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts. Thanks for listening.